What if Ronald Reagan had lost the 1980 election? The 1980 presidential election is historically remembered as a defining moment, one that ushered in the Reagan Revolution and reshaped the political, economic, and cultural landscape of the United States. But what if this critical event had unfolded differently? What if Ronald Reagan, the Republican challenger, had lost to the incumbent Jimmy Carter? Today, we're stepping into an alternate history to speculate on how such a political reversal may have changed the America we know, its economy, international standing, and cultural identity. The year 1980 found America at a crossroads. Jimmy Carter, after narrowly defeating Gerald Ford in 1976, had entered office with a promise to restore trust in government following the Watergate scandal. However, Carter's presidency quickly became bogged down by a series of crises. The economy was plagued by stagflation, a dreaded combination of stagnant growth and high inflation. An energy crisis led to long lines at gas stations, reinforcing the perception of a government struggling to control basic necessities. On the global stage, the Iranian hostage crisis humiliated America as 52 Americans were held captive for 444 days. Cold War tensions with the Soviet Union were escalating, and Carter's deterrence measures, such as the grain embargo and the Olympic boycott, divided public opinion. Amid this backdrop, Ronald Reagan emerged as a charismatic figure, promising morning in America. Riding a wave of growing conservatism, he appealed to voters seeking a hard reset. But what if it hadn't? What if Jimmy Carter had convinced just enough Americans to stick with him for another 4 years? A Carter victory in 1980 would have kept the United States on a very different economic trajectory. Reagan's presidency introduced sweeping tax cuts, the deregulation of industries, and a sharp curtailing of union power. Together, these policies formed what is now widely referred to as Reaganomics, a vision tied to supply-side economic theory. Without Reagan in office, the vision of trickle-down economics might never have taken root. Carter's approach to the economy was far more cautious, centered on targeted government intervention rather than broad deregulation. Would Carter have found a way to tame inflation and unemployment without resorting to deep tax cuts or dismantling regulations? One likely outcome is that unions may have retained much of their power and influence. The economic divide between the working class and corporate interests, a gap that widened significantly in the 1980s, could have been delayed. Manufacturing, which suffered significant losses during the Reagan years, might have seen a softer decline under Carter's policies. On the other hand, Carter faced immense challenges on the inflation front. Absent new, radical policies, public frustration may have deepened in a second Carter term. If economic stagnation had persisted, the appetite for reform might have grown even stronger by the mid-1980s. Foreign policy is another critical area that could have seen dramatic changes under a continued Carter presidency. Reagan's approach to the Cold War was famously hardline, marked by his labeling of the Soviet Union as the evil empire. And his insistence on ramping up defense spending, including the ambitious but controversial Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, often referred to as Star Wars. Carter's methods were far more measured, relying on diplomacy rather than showdowns. It is possible that in this alternate history, Carter's focus on arms limitation and peaceful engagement could have reduced Cold War tensions. The SALT II Treaty, which remained unratified during his presidency, might have been revitalized and implemented under his second term. However, some may argue the opposite. Without Reagan's aggressive posture, the Soviets might have interpreted Carter's diplomacy as weakness. A less confrontational approach may have emboldened Soviet expansionism, prolonging the Cold War and complicating America's global influence. And what of the cultural aftermath of the Iranian hostage crisis? A Carter re-election would undoubtedly have depended on the successful resolution of this debacle. In this timeline, Carter wins in part because the hostages are released. From the Cold War to the Middle East, the absence of Reagan's interventionist policies could have dramatically reshaped America's global footprint. The profound question remains: could Carter's more diplomatic approach have led to a safer world or a more perilous one? The election of Ronald Reagan didn't just mark a political shift. it unleashed a cultural transformation that defined the spirit of the 1980s. Reagan's optimistic vision of America as a shining city on a hill became an anchor for a burgeoning conservative ethos. This cultural movement celebrated individualism, traditional family values, and capitalism, which in turn influenced movies, television, and even fashion. In an alternate version of the 1980s under Jimmy Carter, this conservative cultural shift might have never materialized. Carter's somber tone, which emphasized personal sacrifice and environmental sustainability, contrasted sharply with Reagan's bold declarations of American greatness. Would a Carter victory have left the decade with a less vibrant, or perhaps more socially conscious identity? This scenario also impacts significant social movements. The Reagan administration, with its conservative Supreme Court appointments, often positioned itself against abortion rights, LGBTQ plus advocacy, and drug decriminalization efforts. Without Reagan's influence, some of these battles for social justice might have played out more favorably for progressives. On the flip side, the lack of a unifying cultural moment like Reagan's Morning in America might have left the country appearing directionless amid economic and social challenges. Perhaps Carter's messaging, valuable though it was, lacked the charisma needed to rally and inspire a divided public. Reagan's victory in 1980 birthed the modern conservative movement, a coalition dedicated to small government, a strong defense posture, and fiercely pro-capitalist policies. His popularity not only reshaped the Republican Party, but also forced the Democratic Party to adapt to new political terrain. Would the Republican Party have splintered or evolved differently if Reagan had been defeated? A Carter victory might have re-energized traditional Democratic voters, delaying or mitigating the conservative realignment that dominated the 1980s. In this scenario, we might imagine a delay in the Reagan Revolution and its downstream effects. For example, the rise of highly polarized partisanship. But political history rarely stands still for long. Reagan himself may have remained a powerful voice and contender, possibly running again in 1984. Alternatively, the Republican Party without Reagan's ascendancy might have looked to other charismatic figures, reshaping the conservative message into something else entirely. Meanwhile, a Carter second term would have had implications for the Democratic Party too. Would Carter have managed to unify his increasingly fractious base, or would dissatisfaction have fractured the party further? The Democratic leadership in the mid-1980s might have looked entirely different. Future elections are another fascinating arena for speculation. A Carter administration that stagnates might set the stage for a resounding Republican victory in 1984, possibly led by a rising star of the party. Could George H.W. Bush or another figure have carried the conservative banner, creating an entirely different historical dynamic? Alternatively, if Carter managed to turn the economy around and strengthen relations abroad, the Democratic Party might have prolonged its dominance, leaving Reagan and the conservative movement as merely footnotes in history. The absence of Reagan's transformative policies would have left enduring questions about America's identity. Would the growth of political polarization in the 1990s and 2000s have been softened if Reagan's brand of politics had been delayed or never arrived? What ripple effects on global politics, trade, and alliances might have emerged? History is full of turning points, but few elections have carried the weight and influence of the 1980 presidential contest. Ronald Reagan's presidency became a defining chapter, not just in the 1980s, but in the shape of modern politics, economics, and culture. Imagining a world where Reagan lost in 1980 opens a door to compelling possibilities. A second Carter presidency might have led to a different economic structure, a delayed end to the Cold War, and a cultural identity rooted more in sacrifice than ambition. On the other hand, the absence of Reagan's rise could have left America less energized and more uncertain about its future. Ultimately, this alternate timeline invites us to reflect on the power of elections and the ripple effects of leadership. How would America and the world be different today if Ronald Reagan never sat in the Oval Office? What might we have gained, and what might we have lost? Let us know your thoughts in the comments as we continue this speculative journey together. Like and subscribe for more from History Twist.